7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Hello, I'm Dale Yurton, and welcome to our study on the promise. We're looking at the birth of Moses, how that his life was preserved so that he became the deliverer of Israel from slavery in Egypt. This particular lesson I'm calling Releasing the Promise. If you have not listened to the previous lessons, please do. The first lesson we talked about birthing the promise. Then the last lesson we talked about preserving the promise. In this lesson, releasing the promise. Now, it's a good statement. The reason that many people end up in the wrong place is they stayed in the right place too long. Oh, I've seen that over and over again. Good people, they just simply stay in the right place too long. See, if we're not careful, when God helps us to birth a promise, God gives us a promise, we fall in love with the promise. It's a mistake to love the promise more than the God who gave us the promise. And I think it's one of the reasons why many times God will test us, like Abraham. God gives him the promised son, Isaac. And then God asks him to give the young man back to him again. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. Why would God do that? God's testing him to see if he loves the promise more than he loves God. I believe God has a right to test us. If Amram and Jochebed had not been willing to release the promise, they would have killed the promise by just holding on to it. And it's sad to say, but I've seen this happen in churches many times. When a good pastor that he loves the church. In fact, maybe he loves the church more than he loves Jesus. He falls in love with the church, and he will not release it to the hands of someone else. And I've seen good men, good pastors that killed churches. The churches died with them. What a tragedy. I do not believe that is the will of God. So how does Amram and Jochebed, how do they overcome this and become willing to release the promise into the hands of God? I wanted to talk about three main areas that I see that were a challenge to them. And I think these are the things that you and I relate to. The first one is hearts that are willing to trust. Hearts that are willing to trust. It's a good statement. Trust is a higher form of faith. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about trust? We're talking about there are so many things that are beyond our understanding. In fact, that's the reason that our relationship with God is not based upon our intellect, how much we know in knowledge. No, it's based upon our heart. Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. He's talking about our spirit, our human spirit. And this is where trust comes from. Trust is a higher form of faith because there are so many times that we will not understand God's plan, but we still must believe God's plan even when we don't understand it. Now, that is not talking in circles. That's not talking in riddles. It's just simply saying we do not live the Christian life based solely upon what we know mentally. It's based upon what we experience spiritually from our heart, from our spirit. I've seen people that try to live the Christian life from their heads, and it's always a mistake. We always get it wrong. We always emphasize the wrong things, and we miss God's best promises, because we're not believing with the heart. With the heart, man believes unto salvation. That's how our relationship with God is built, upon trust. Going back to the story of Moses and his birth, there is no way that his mother, Jochebed, could understand how that God was going to use Moses to deliver Israel. There's no way she had all the facts and information, and we never will. It's why the Bible warns us we do not walk by sight. And he's talking about natural sight, natural understanding, but we live by faith. By faith. That's the way that we follow God. There's always the risk factor in following God by faith, because there's the unknown, the things that we do not know. Are you willing to trust God with the things you don't understand? Are you willing to commit that into his hand, that he knows what is best? Or that is a factor that every one of us must deal with. See, for instance, in Jochebed's life, there's no way she could understand how God was going to use Moses except one way. What's that? By faith. Except by faith. By faith, she can trust God with the things that she can't figure out with her mind. The Bible is very plain about this. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He says, they're as high as the heaven is above the earth. That's a great distance. That's how high God's thoughts are above our thoughts. But at the same time, by faith, we can understand. I love Hebrews, the 11th chapter and verse 3. It's been one of my favorite texts for so many years. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Science has confirmed that today, when they'll take the electron microscope and they will be able to look at tiny pieces, particles. They'll be able to look at molecules and atoms that we cannot see with the natural eye, but they are there. Things which are unseen, that everything else is produced. It's built upon those things that are unseen, so that the things which are seen are made of things which are invisible. Again, in the same 11th chapter of Hebrews, in verse 6, the writer says, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. See, this is a heart that's willing to trust, a heart that believes God even when they don't understand what is going on. And that's what happens in Amram and Jochebed's life. They cannot figure out why they are slaves, why they were born in slavery, why the king has given this death decree for all the baby boys. But as someone as well said, when we cannot see God's hand, we must trust God's heart. I love that statement, because it all comes back to this. How much are we willing to trust God? The Apostle Paul warns us about our failure to believe, our failure to trust. In Romans 14 and 23, Paul says, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats. He's talking about eating things that have been offered in an idolatrous temple, because he does not eat from faith. He gives us the principle, for whatever is not from faith is sin. Well, that is a powerful statement, and it relates to our lives today. If we're not living by faith, if we're not walking by faith, acting in faith, speaking in faith, anything that is not from faith is sin. So it begins with a heart that's willing to trust God. Here's the second thing that I want to give you. Hands that are willing to let go, to release it. Actually, what our hands are doing, our hands are disclosing our heart. If we truly trust God, if we truly believe God, then we will be willing to let it go, to release it. If we don't, all we're doing is revealing the unbelief in our heart. To refuse to let go is a sign of unbelief, because it takes faith to release the promise into God's hands. That's what Jochebed was willing to do. I commend her so highly. Because of her act of faith, God was able to raise up a deliverer to deliver them from their slavery. But if she had refused to do that, God would have had to have looked for someone else that believed him enough to trust him. Someone has well said, obedience to God's plan is love in action. I believe that. It's love in action. It's revealing our heart that we truly do trust God because we're willing to obey God. We're willing to do what God tells us to do, even when it does not go according to our natural understanding. It seems like a crazy idea to put the baby in a basket at the very place that she knows the princess is going to come to bathe. But she's acting in faith. This lady has spent a lot of time in prayer. And when it's your baby, I tell you, you will pray when it's your baby. You love the baby, you would do anything you could. You would give your life for the baby. And so she's praying. I assure you, she's praying. But here's the point. It takes more than prayer to save the baby. And I think this is where a lot of Christians fail, because they do pray. Many of them pray desperately. But when God speaks to them, they are not willing to act upon the thoughts, the ideas, the plans that God gave them as an answer to their prayer. God is answering their prayer, but because they do not believe, they do not trust, they're not willing to let go. So it takes more than just prayer to save the baby. When we start praying, God will answer our prayers. He's promised to do that. And the way that he answers it, he shows us what we need to do. He gives us direction, instructions on what we are to obey. And so now it's time for our hands to let it go, to do whatever it was that God told us to do. In Jochebed's case, God instructs her, get a basket. Make this basket waterproof. Make it where that not one drop of water can get into the basket. See, now this is where so many people go wrong with their prayer life. They're praying that God will protect the baby in the basket, but they haven't done their part. They've not been responsible in waterproofing the basket. The River Nile, I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, but it's not the more pristine water in the world. It's a very dirty river, very muddy river, and there's a lot of things in the river that would cause death. It just wouldn't be safe to drink the water from the River Nile unless it had first been purified. It has death in it. And what that is a good picture of the world that is all around us. The world that surrounds us is filled with death, with bacteria, with virus, with all kinds of things that will harm us, which will bring death. And so it's her responsibility to see that not one drop of water from the River Nile was able to enter the basket. Because the problem is, if one drop can enter, then two can enter, and then a third can enter, and sooner than later, the baby is now wet, the baby's soaked, and the baby will get sick, the baby will die, or if enough water gets into the basket will sink, and the baby will drown. So it's her responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. You watch Jochebed as she's sealed this basket in love. She has tarred it, pitched it. I mean, there's no way any water can get in this basket. And so she feeds her baby and kisses him for the last time. She rocks him to sleep in her arms because she knows she's only got a short time, maybe 2-3 hours before the baby will wake up from being hungry again. Even though he's rocking, gently in the waves of the river Nile, because the water, is providing a nice shady place for him to sleep, but he's going to get hungry and wake up. So she's got to make sure she gets him there at the right time so he doesn't wake up too soon or it discloses her secret. So she lovingly kisses him, places him in the basket for what she thinks is the last time. How could she do this? I tell you how she could do it. She did it because of faith. She did it because she believed that God would do what she could not do. And that's the way you and I must live our lives. We must be willing to believe God, to trust God, to do the things that we cannot do. We do our best, then God goes to work. After we have done everything that we can do, we have the right to believe God to do what we cannot do. When we've done the possible, we can believe God for the impossible. And so she believes that God is going to save the baby she cannot save. She can hide him no longer. She's gone as far as she can go. But there is no place that God cannot go. And she believes that God is going to protect her baby, save her baby, and cause him to become the deliverer of Israel. This is what the prophet was talking about when he used the phrase, wait on the Lord. Jochebed had done everything she could do. Now it was time for her to wait on the Lord. Waiting on the Lord doesn't mean sitting down and doing nothing. No, that's not what it means at all. It means we're to seek after God with all our heart. Do what we can do, and then there's a point where we have to release it and let it go. The prophet Isaiah said it so well. Isaiah 40:31. Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Boy, that is a good picture of Jochebed, of what Jochebed has done for her baby Moses. Now, something else I noticed that she does. As she releases the baby, she knows she can't stand guard. That would be too obvious. A woman, obviously a young mother, standing watching a basket floating in water, a basket containing a baby. That would be obvious she is the mother. So she can't do that. What does she do? She stations Miriam, Moses' sister, there to watch the basket. Stand over here at a distance. Don't get too close. Stay back away, but keep watching. See what's going to happen. Miriam is there watching when suddenly the princess spots the basket, asks it to be brought. They open the basket and the baby begins to cry. And somebody says, he's hungry. Oh, that's when Miriam sprung into action. Now, notice this. Jochebed has to be willing to trust the next generation to guard the promise. The same is true for us. And I think it's one of the reasons why some people stay in the right place too long. They don't trust the next generation. Let me tell you, friend, the same God that worked in my life, in your life, will work in their life. He's the same God. The same God that called us will call them and speak to them. And so Jochebed is willing to trust Miriam, a little girl that's 6 or 7 years of age. She's willing to trust her. See, there's always a risk factor that's involved in obeying God. You don't know exactly how God's going to do it. But if you really believe, you'll be willing to take the risk. As she told her, you stay here and watch and see. That was her job. The question is, are we watching with eyes of faith or eyes of unbelief? How are we guarding the promise? Are we watching with eyes of faith? I challenge you to do so. In Psalm 27 in verse 13, I have loved this verse since I was a young man. I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I do believe it, just like Jochebed believed. Now here's the third thing I want to address. The third thing is arms that are willing to embrace. Now what a surprise in Jochebed's life. She lets the promise go, leaves Miriam, Moses' sister, there to stand guard, but the little girl comes up with a brilliant idea. Many times this is the way God works. He uses the next generation to come up with a great idea. Do you need a nurse for the baby? Oh, what a good question. Miriam knew she couldn't feed the baby, but she knew somebody that could. No, she's just a little girl. She can't feed the baby, but she knew the baby's mother. And because of her relationship with Jochebed, she is able to bring Jochebed to the princess, and the princess said, take this baby and feed him. What a surprise. Jochebed never dreamed that it would turn out like this. And the same is true for you. When you and I are willing to trust God, God has some great ideas. God has some good things in store for us that we don't even know about. The baby is given back to her, plus she's given wages to feed the baby. How many mothers would love that deal? But there's a difference here. The difference is just the wages tells us something has changed in the relationship between Jochebed and her baby. What has changed? Something has changed in the relationship. Here's what's changed. She has given her baby to another woman. She has given her baby away to the princess. And now the princess is saying, I will give you wages if you will nurse this baby for me. Wow. For God to be able to fulfill his promise in our lives, we must be willing to trust others. Jochebed had to be willing to trust the princess. The princess had to be willing to work with Jochebed because she needed somebody that could nurse the baby, could feed the baby. Otherwise, the baby will get sick and die. And so they have to work together. That's right. Jochebed is working together with the princess to save baby Moses. God help us. If she can do it, you and I can do it. And there are good people. It's one of the things I've discovered, that all the good people are not in the church. And I've also discovered all the bad people are not in the world. There are some good people there that God will use their lives to help fulfill the promise within our lives. And so Jochebed realizes, I must work together with the princess to preserve baby Moses. There's something else she realizes. This brings another revelation to her. She knows she's only got a short period of time to train the baby. There's a lot of things she wants to tell the baby. There's things that she wants him to know. He is not an Egyptian, he is an Israelite. She wants him to know, you are a very special baby. God preserved your life because God is going to use you to deliver his people. And so she's not just wasting her time singing sweet lullabies, rocking the baby to sleep. No, she's whispering to him, you're an Israelite. You're not an Egyptian. God has saved your life so you can save his people. That's what Jochebed is telling him. There's an amazing verse of scripture in Acts, the 7th chapter, and verse 25, where you find the preaching deacon Stephen says, for he, speaking of Moses, he supposed that his brethren would understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they did not understand. Now the question is, where did Moses get an idea like this? He's 40 years of age when he goes down to visit his brethren. How does he know that the Israelites are his brethren? Where does he come up with an idea that God is going to use him to deliver them? He thought everybody knew it because his mother had taught him that. That's where he got that idea. Jochebed had put that within him, had planted those seeds of faith within him. God help us as parents to be able to do it for our children. God help us as leaders to be able to do it for the next generation, to plant the seeds of faith within them so that they can believe, so that they understand the church is not my church, it belongs to Jesus. Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail. That's God's idea. We've got to come into harmony with heaven. Now, the question that I want to close with, two questions actually. First of all, are we looking up? Are we looking up? Jesus said that. When you come to the end and you see all these things that are happening around you, look up. Your redemption draws nigh. That's what we need to do. Secondly, are we believing God? Is our faith in something bigger than ourselves? Something greater than our family? Something greater than our people? God help us to put our faith in him. And if we do, God has some surprises. He will give us blessings, bountiful blessings. He'll open the windows of heaven if we will keep on believing the promise of God.